We're told civilization began with agriculture, then cities, then writing, a neat progression from primitive to complex. But the oldest Sumerian tablets tell a different story, one that starts not with human innovation, but with a descent from the sky. These clay fragments, pressed with wedge-shaped marks over 5,000 years ago, describe a city that existed before human kings, before recorded history as we know it began. A place where beings called the Anunnaki first touched Earth. And here's what makes this more than mythology. The tablets repeatedly warn that this sacred site was forbidden, guarded, off-limits to ordinary mortals. Why would the earliest civilization on record preserve detailed accounts of a city humans weren't allowed to enter? What was being protected or hidden behind those gates? The Sumerian texts don't just mention this place in passing. They describe its temples, its positioning, its function as a boundary between two worlds. They name it specifically. And when we cross-reference these ancient accounts with modern archaeological surveys, something emerges that mainstream chronology struggles to explain. The oldest temple foundations in Mesopotamia align precisely with the location these tablets identify as the landing site of the gods. The Sumerian king list is one of the most studied documents from the ancient world. Scholars use it to date dynasties and track the rise of city-states. But before it catalogues human rulers, it makes a curious statement. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not established, not founded, descended. The text treats this transfer of authority as an arrival, an installation from above rather than a development from within. Cuneiform tablets from multiple Mesopotamian cities, Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, independently reference Eridu as the city of the first kings, but they add layers that complicate the standard interpretation. They describe structures that predated the flood, temples raised in the time when heaven and earth were connected. The Eridu Genesis, preserved in fragmentary form, explains that before humans built cities, before they knew agriculture, the Anunnaki established their first dwelling place at the site that would become Eridu. The tablet describes Enki, the Anunnaki leader associated with wisdom and water, creating order from chaos at this specific location. The language isn't vague. It provides geographical markers, describes the marshland environment, documents the construction of a temple foundation. Administrative texts from the 3rd millennium BCE reference Eridu's temple as Abzu, the house of the Abzu, and they consistently treat it differently than other religious sites. While temples in Uruk or Ur are described with standard dedicatory language, Eridu's sanctuary receives language that suggests function beyond worship. Ritual texts specify elaborate purification requirements for anyone approaching the inner precinct, multiple washings, specific garments, designated waiting periods. These weren't symbolic gestures. The tablets describe them as mandatory procedures with severe consequences for violation. Could these be describing primitive religious superstition, or were they protocols for accessing something that required actual physical preparation? The Sumerian king list identifies Eridu with absolute clarity, the first city where divine authority manifested on earth. But what do the temple hymns and ritual texts actually tell us about this place? When we examine the primary sources, not the summaries in history books, but the translated tablets themselves, a specific picture develops. The city sat at the edge of the marshlands, where the Euphrates met the Persian Gulf, a liminal zone the Sumerians described as neither fully land nor water. Temple hymns call it the pure place, the shining key of heaven, and the mooring post of the gods. These aren't generic religious phrases. They appear across multiple text traditions with consistent geographic details. The archaeological site identified as Eridu, modern Tel Abu Shahrain, contains temple foundations that carbon date to approximately 5,400 BCE, making it among the oldest religious structures ever excavated. 18 successive temples were built on the same spot, each constructed directly atop the ruins of the previous one, maintaining precise alignment over 3 millennia. The earliest levels show architectural sophistication that appears suddenly, without the experimental phases we'd expect from a developing society. The foundation platform, the orientation, the interior chamber design, established in full form at the first construction level. Administrative texts from Ur describe Eridu's temple as the dwelling of Enki, but they add a detail that rarely appears in general histories. The temple was called the house which is not empty. An odd phrase to emphasize unless the norm was abandonment or symbolic use. This suggests permanent occupation, continuous presence, something ongoing rather than ceremonial. Ritual texts specify that approach to the inner sanctum required passing through 7 gates, each with its own guardian and purification requirement. The repetition of 7 gates, 7 layers of cleansing, 7 epithets for the temple, appears too structured to be arbitrary. Could this represent security protocols, a system of controlled access to protect whatever the inner chambers contained? The temple hymns preserved at Nippur contain a passage that describes Eridu's inner sanctum in language that shifts from devotional to procedural. The text specifies doors of lapis lazuli that no impure hand may push open. Chambers where the me are guarded, and gates attended by beings called Galu, often translated as gatekeepers, but literally meaning great ones who hold the boundary. These weren't symbolic guardians in the mythological sense. Administrative tablets record rations allocated to temple guards at Eridu, personnel rosters that distinguish between outer courtyard attendants and inner chamber watchers who served in rotating shifts. The detail is bureaucratic, practical, resource-driven. Why does a temple need guard rotations documented in grain disbursement records? The architectural evidence creates additional questions. When archaeologists excavated the earliest temple levels, they found an unusual feature. The central chamber possessed no windows, received no natural light, and contained a floor plan that didn't match the worship space design of later Mesopotamian temples. The chamber was small, rectangular, with walls nearly 3 times thicker than structural necessity required. Ventilation shafts extended downward rather than upward, an engineering choice that makes no sense for incense dispersal or air circulation in a room used for ritual gatherings. Unless the room wasn't designed for gatherings, unless it was built to contain something rather than accommodate people. Ritual texts from the old Babylonian period describe access protocols for Eridu's inner precinct that exceed any other temple in Mesopotamia. Priests underwent a 7-day purification sequence before entering. They bathed in consecrated water brought from specific channels of the Abzu. They wore linen garments that had never touched the ground. They could carry no metal objects across the threshold. These requirements aren't standard religious purity laws. Metal restrictions, in particular, appear nowhere else in Sumerian temple codes. Was this religious theater? Or were these functional requirements to prevent some form of contamination or interference? The Me, those mysterious divine principles the Sumerians believed governed reality, were said to be stored at Eridu before Inanna famously stole them and brought them to Uruk. But the text described the Me not as abstract concepts, but as physical objects that could be carried, hidden, transferred. The Enki-Inanna myth specifies that they were kept in a chamber that no hand but Enki's could open, protected by locks that responded only to him. Metaphor for exclusive knowledge or description of an actual restricted access system. Cylinder seals from the early dynastic period depict Eridu's temple with winged figures stationed at doorways, facing outward rather than inward, the posture of sentries watching for external approach, not worshippers welcoming visitors. And here's what disrupts the standard interpretation. These figures carry objects identified in accompanying cuneiform as weapons, not ceremonial staffs or symbolic implements, but tools explicitly labeled with the Sumerian term for that which strikes down. The Forbidden City wasn't just sacred, it was defended. Beneath Eridu's temple complex, the texts describe something that exists at the boundary between geography and cosmology, the Abzu. Standard translations call it the deep or primordial waters, treating it as mythological space, the aquatic chaos from which creation emerged. But the Sumerian sources don't describe the Abzu in abstract terms. They give it physical parameters, document its connection to the temple, specify its role in Enki's operations on Earth. Temple construction texts reference the Abzu as a structure beneath Eridu, accessible through the temple foundation. Administrative records from the Ur-3 document pure water brought from the Abzu for ritual purposes, not metaphorical purity, but actual water drawn from a specific subterranean source and transported in sealed vessels to other cities. The logistics suggest not a concept, but a location, a place you could access, extract resources from, interact with physically. The Enki myths consistently position the Abzu as his private domain, the seat of his wisdom, the storehouse of knowledge that other Anunnaki couldn't access without permission. In Enki and the World Order, he's described as the Lord who decides fates while dwelling in the Abzu, administering civilization's development from this underground seat. The language parallels administrative texts that describe governors ruling from palace complexes, territorial language, not devotional abstraction. Incantation texts preserve another detail. They refer to the Abzu as having foundations in the deep earth and a roof that reaches to the temple floor above. This describes vertical architecture, chambers stacked beneath the surface structure, connected by passages that allowed movement between levels. Archaeological surveys at Tel Abu Shahrain identified anomalies in ground-penetrating radar scans, geometric voids beneath the temple platform that don't match natural geological formations. The Iraqi State Board of Antiquities documented these findings in the 1980s, but political instability prevented excavation. The data shows regular, angular spaces at least 15 meters below the visible foundation level. The texts describe the Abzu as containing Enki's great works, the mechanisms by which he directed the growth of grain, the flow of rivers, the fertility of livestock. Modern readers assume metaphor, divine will expressed as natural processes, but Sumerian literature distinguished between poetic praise and technical description. When hymns wanted to be symbolic, they used simile, like the sun as a storm. When they describe the Abzu, they use direct statements, where the me are, which holds the seed of the land, from which the waters rise. They documented function, not comparison. Could the Abzu have been an operational facility, a base of some kind, positioned beneath the first Anunnaki structure on Earth, designed to remain concealed while allowing access through the temple above? The architectural evidence, chambers with no windows, downward ventilation, abnormal wall thickness, aligns with a structure meant to connect to something below, rather than open to the sky above. The ritual restrictions, metal prohibitions, purification sequences, guarded access, match protocols for controlling entry to a sensitive installation, not guidelines for approaching a symbolic holy space. The texts make another claim that rarely receives attention. They state that the Abzu existed before Eridu was built. The temple wasn't constructed over sacred waters. It was positioned above an existing site that the Anunnaki had already designated. The city grew around the access point. This inverts the standard model where religious significance develops after human settlement. Here, the location determined the settlement. The Anunnaki chose this spot first. Everything else followed. Eridu should have thrived. It held the oldest temple, the most sacred ground, direct association with Enki himself, the Anunnaki figure credited with giving humanity the gifts of civilization. Yet the archaeological record shows something unexpected. The city was abandoned and resettled repeatedly across its history, and eventually left empty for good, while other Mesopotamian cities continued to flourish. The Sumerian texts themselves shift in tone when describing Eridu's later periods. The reverential language remains, but it's joined by something else. Distance, caution, a reluctance to specify what happened there. The lament for Eridu, composed during the Ur-3 period, describes the city as silent, its temple empty of the me, its gates standing open to the desert wind. But the lament doesn't describe an enemy attack or natural disaster. It describes withdrawal. The gods turned away their gaze. The divine presence returned to heaven. The guardians no longer stood at the threshold. Ritual activity didn't cease because the city was destroyed. It ceased because the site was vacated. The text treats this as an intentional departure, not a catastrophic loss. Environmental studies offer one explanation. The Persian Gulf coastline shifted dramatically between 5000 and 3000 BCE. Eridu's position at the water's edge, the feature that made it the mooring post of heaven, became a liability as the shoreline receded and marshlands dried. The city lost its geographic advantage, its access to trade routes, its freshwater channels. But this doesn't explain why the site retained sacred status even after abandonment, why later kings continued to make pilgrimages to ruins, why texts warned against casual approach to a place that no longer functioned as a city. Administrative records from the old Babylonian period reference Eridu as the sealed city, a designation that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian literature. Ritual texts from this era specify that any person entering the abandoned temple precinct required authorization from the priesthood in Ur and had to perform purification rites before and after visiting. These weren't guidelines for approaching an active holy site. Eridu had been largely empty for centuries by this point. These were protocols for accessing a place that remained restricted despite having no permanent population. Later, Sumerian and Akkadian omens reference Eridu in unsettling contexts. A tablet from Nineveh preserved this line: "If a man dreams he stands at the gate of Eridu, he will lose what he guards." Another: "If flood waters reach the foundations of the Abzu, great ones will depart from the land." The omens treat Eridu not as a source of blessing, but as a site of dangerous potency, a place where boundaries could fail, where what was meant to remain separated might breach containment. Could the abandonment relate to whatever the Abzu actually contained? If it functioned as the texts suggest, a subterranean operational center for Anunnaki activity, its usefulness would have ended when that activity ceased. The temple above served as access point and protective boundary once the Anunnaki withdrew, once the me were removed. The structure became not sacred space, but an empty shell above a sealed facility. Perhaps the restrictions, the purification requirements, the warnings against approach were not protecting divine holiness. They were preventing access to something that had been intentionally closed. The Eridu Genesis tablet, fragmented though it is, contains a passage describing Enki's final acts at the city. The translation remains disputed, but the general sense describes him sealing the house, fixing the door, placing the watchers who do not sleep. The terminology matches security language from palace archive texts, actions taken to secure a site before departure, not rituals performed during active occupation. The forbidden city remained forbidden even in ruins. Later, Mesopotamian cultures built new temples, established new cult centers, transferred religious authority to Nippur and Babylon. But they never rebuilt Eridu's inner sanctum. They maintained the outer structures, conducted memorial rites in the courtyard, but the chamber with the abnormally thick walls, the space that once connected to the Abzu below, was left sealed. Archaeological surveys confirm that the central room in the earliest temple level was deliberately filled with clay and rubble at some point in antiquity, not from collapse, but from intentional blocking. The texts preserved one final detail. A wisdom composition from the late Sumerian period states, "What Eridu holds, Eridu keeps. What was given to the deep does not return." This wasn't religious poetry about eternal devotion. The phrasing matches legal language, contractual terms, binding agreements, declarations of permanent transfer. Something was left at Eridu. Something was placed in the Abzu, and according to the oldest written words we possess, it was meant to stay there. The tablets we've examined don't offer neat conclusions. They offer coordinates, architectural details, ritual restrictions, and a persistent claim that pulls against everything we assume about mythology. That before humans ruled cities, something else did, and it started at Eridu. The Forbidden City sits at the intersection of our oldest written records and our most uncomfortable questions about what those records actually preserve. Mainstream scholarship treats Eridu as the cradle of Mesopotamian religion, the site where temple culture began, the origin point of urban priesthood. But that explanation requires ignoring the functional language in the texts, the guard rotations, the purification protocols, the water extracted from underground chambers, the metal restrictions that appear nowhere else, the sealed rooms that were filled with rubble rather than rebuilt. It requires treating every administrative detail as symbolic embellishment rather than documentation. The Anunnaki narrative, if we follow the Sumerian sources without imposing later theological frameworks, describes a landing, a descent from sky to earth, the establishment of a base of operations, the selection of a specific location for reasons the texts consistently link to the Abzu beneath, and then eventually a departure that left the site forbidden not because it was too sacred to approach, but because it contained something that needed to remain isolated. We're left with architecture that doesn't match its supposed function, with restrictions that exceed religious convention, with a city that became more taboo after it emptied than when it thrived, with texts that describe the Abzu not as mythological origin water, but as a place with foundations, chambers, and controlled access, with cylinder seals showing armed sentries at temple gates, with ground-penetrating radar detecting geometric voids beneath temple platforms that have never been excavated. Could Eridu have been exactly what the oldest human writing claims it was? The first place the Anunnaki established presence on Earth, anchored by a subterranean installation that predated the temple built above it? Could the Forbidden City have been restricted not to protect human worshippers from divine holiness, but to prevent human access to operational infrastructure that was sealed when its builders left? The fragments don't give us certainty, but they give us enough detail to recognize that what we call mythology might be the only testimony we have from witnesses who recorded what they saw, preserved it in clay, and trusted future generations to eventually understand what they couldn't fully explain. Eridu's secrets remain beneath the Iraqi sand. The Abzu, if it exists as the texts describe, remains sealed, and the Forbidden City continues to guard whatever the deep was meant to keep.